A very pleasant good day to all of our viewers. Welcome to another edition of Let's Talk. We are delighted that you have chosen to join us this afternoon. Of course, every Sabbath afternoon at 3 p.m. Atlantic Standard Time, we are here to share in discussion. We talk about issues impacting the church and the wider community. And for the last 2 weeks, we have been talking with Dr. Ivor English, talking about the sociological impact of changing gender roles. And this afternoon, we are going to be going into the issue of women's liberation and the implications for the church and the Christian community, more or less. Before we go any further, though, we would like to invite you to bow your heads for a word of prayer with us. Eternal Father and our God, we thank you for the opportunity to again meet to share, to discuss this important subject as we discuss elements of women's liberation and its impact on the church and the Christian community. We pray for your wisdom and your guidance. Be with Dr. English as he shares with us from his knowledge base and expertise. We ask for your guidance and your directions in Jesus' name. Amen. Dr. English, good afternoon and welcome to Let's Talk.
Yeah, good afternoon, Dr. Greene. It's a privilege to be here again.
We have been for the last 2 weeks discussing this important subject. We have been looking at the sociological impact of changing gender roles, particularly from a Caribbean perspective. And this afternoon, we are dovetailing into the whole concept of the female liberation movement and the implications for the church. I want to begin, Doc, by sharing that when I remember when I did my master's program, my research focus was the social liberation motive in the book of Luke and Acts. And the aim there was to show that Dr. Luke was deliberate in emphasizing that Jesus had a clear intention to liberate women. We notice, particularly in the books of Luke and Acts, that Luke portrays Jesus as having women walking around with him. He seems to deliberately elevate their status. He was doing a strange thing because in Jesus's day, women were very underrated. They were marginalized. In fact, there was, my research shows, a group of Pharisees who called themselves the Bleeding Pharisees. And they got that nickname, rather, they were nicknamed the Bleeding Pharisees because if they ever saw a woman in the streets, they would hit their head against the wall until it bleeds. A woman's place was considered in the home only. And so with Jesus having women accompanying him, Luke was demonstrating that Jesus had a clear intention to liberate women, to do something. What is the philosophy behind women's liberation?
I think when you look at women's liberation in a general context, the philosophy, to my mind, was predicated on giving recognition to the individual, irrespective of gender and even class, sociocultural circumstances. And to my mind, that was all part of the message of Christ himself. For me, the liberation of women effectively began when Christ came to show that there was no difference. We all sin and come short of the glory of God. And man was used in a generic sense. Man has sinned, and therefore there was now equality, or we'll commonly say, at the foot of the cross, the ground is level. So the philosophy was that people should not be alienated or isolated or subjugated, but they must be treated as human beings with equality in the sight of God. For in the sight of God, all men are equal. And therefore, when we think liberation of women, it must start from that premise, notwithstanding the reality that those societies were patriarchal in nature, and there was obviously discrimination against women. Christ wanted to address that, and even the issue that stretched back from the days of the Mosaic laws. So to my mind, the vision behind liberation was to create that change.
Okay, very well. Now, it's interesting that you indicated, as I have discovered in my research, that the whole issue of liberation was very prominent in the life of Jesus. I think we also see that in the whole aspect of, for example, Jesus, a woman, and again, Luke is big on this, was the first person to see Jesus after the resurrection. A woman was given the commission to share the good news before any man. And these to me are elements of highlighting the equality of the races. I don't know if you have a comment on that.
Yeah, because if you look at it, that Jesus came by way of a woman. And if you, not just by way of a woman, but I think in the lineage or the genealogy of Jesus, there was some level of proactivity, as it were, and a fight for recognition and to demonstrate assertiveness. If we go back to the genealogy of Jesus, we see Rahab, the harlot, and we understand, we see people like Ruth coming through, and these women, Ruth being married to Boaz and working towards advancement and development. Then Mary, the virgin girl, who for all intents and purposes becoming the mother of Jesus, you know, that was a serious taboo for a woman to be pregnant outside of wedlock. And then you could be stoned. So when you look at it, there was a close association, a very close association with women, and the significant women that form part of the, I will say, the genealogy of Jesus, the role played by women in the Old Testament time.
Now, I want to think that there is very little doubt, as we discussed last week, that many of the social norms regarding gender and roles no longer apply in most of the developed world. I think when you look at, even to some extent in the developing world, women run marathons and play tennis and cricket and fly fighter bombers and you know, operate heavy equipment and that kind of thing. Now, there may be some men who still believe that women should not be doing these kinds of things, but the reality is it is happening. I want to suggest, and I could be wrong here, but I want to suggest that it is the struggle or the fight that many women had to endure, so to speak, to get into this once restricted domain of male-dominated space that creates the feeling of having to struggle for liberation among so many women. What's your perspective on the inequality claims? You know, males and females, you hear sometimes in the news that there are individuals who do the same work, but they're at differently remunerated, etc. What's your perspective on the claims of inequality?
I think there there's still claims of inequality in some quarters, because of course there are some jobs that women still find difficult to cope with. And when women become involved, it's the exception rather than the rule. For example, in our country, in the mining sector, the work of the miners, very strenuous. I've done some of that myself in earlier life, very strenuous. So women's role in that industry, mainly they go as buyers or cooks, or to offer support services, rather than actually in the hardcore, physical, laborious mining activity before you had technology and improve our mechanization that caused it to be done in that way. But the question of inequality continues to linger in some quarters because of the traditional orientation, particularly of men. People will feel, some people say they do not feel safe if the premises is guarded by a female security guard, for example. So already there is discrimination. But from my own experience, there are some women that are stronger and more amenable to carrying out certain tasks than men. And I've seen women physically manhandle men. So one cannot deduce that a particular task is designed for a particular individual. In my studies, I came across a beautiful philosophical quotation from Greek antiquity by Plato, who said that the talent is not necessarily located in a particular class. And I will stretch that to say that it is not necessarily located in a particular gender, because by and large, we have begun to see now with our own eyes that women have been assuming critical roles in industry, in education, in politics, in economy, and are making serious strides, and even are more progressive and productive than men. But as I said last week, when people's minds are focused on a particular worldview or philosophy, particularly if it's rooted in traditions, man is not like institution, I said then. Man takes time to change. You can break and build institution, but man is like your personality. Your personality never changes in block. Elements of your personality will change, but you don't have a total transformation. Like a man coming to Christ and he's a pedophile. We're not going to accept him readily until we can test and prove that he will not recidivist.
Interesting. You know, you kind of suggested. Well, I think it is true that you may have a few ladies who can definitely manhandle some men. But I think we would want to agree that generally males are physically stronger than women. Emotionally, that's a different story, and so on. So in many ways, women are stronger than men. We know that women tend to recover faster from certain diseases and infections and those kinds of things. In fact, there is research that suggests in certain places where things like malaria are very prominent, that it appears somehow that biology seems to favor women in terms of childbirth. But we won't go into that discussion now. My I just want to jump to this and ask you this direct question. Is misogyny an issue in the Caribbean context today, and is that in any way related to the female liberation agenda? And maybe I should for the benefit of any viewer who may not quite readily understand the term misogyny, we're talking about the one's attitude towards women, maybe thinking women are second-class citizens, that there's some things they should not do, there's some jobs they shouldn't have, etc.
That even you started out by looking at how Jesus viewed women and Dr. Luke in particular. Coming back from that era, I think women were looked at, for example, a woman was always under the charge or command of a man, whether a father figure or husband, and even in the case of inheritance, or eldest son. And that, to my mind, was more culturally located than anything else. And from the beginning of time, a woman was created to be the helpmeet of man, to be at the side of man, to be his companion. And some people trivialize it or put it in a simplistic way to say that the man was created first, and then God took a rib from the man to create woman. So in a general sense, the woman is dependent on the man. Maybe there is some justification for that, but to render the woman as being subservient to man, to my mind, it will not change because of the philosophy and thinking of some men. It's been going on for generations this way, and men will continue to feel that way unless there is a revolutionary change. And while the women's liberation movement has tried significantly to redress some of the situation, by and large, in subtle ways, it continues. Let me give you an example. It's only within the last 4 decades, let's say in service clubs organizations like Lions Clubs International, women only got in there close to 4 decades ago. And that no doubt came from the struggles of women for change and equality. And still, while they've come, they've made a tremendous impact and changed the face of the organization in service organization forever. I will think the most progressive clubs are the clubs where you have women input. And therefore, while men hold this view, they're being proven wrong daily, as women contribute in all spheres of life. But the traditional man, and in the Caribbean, men hold on to that quite a lot. They don't want women to share ideas. They feel that women are subservient and I must not listen to their views. They are given to emotionalism. They don't think straight on some issues, and therefore we'll continue to perpetuate that kind of philosophy. But I said daily, momently, they are being proven wrong. I agree that some jobs would be difficult for women, particularly women like to maintain that very feminine touch and look. And in some jobs, it can be very tedious. It requires muscles, rigors. But you made an interesting point, which I must look at in relation to the oil mining sector, that women tend to be more resilient when it comes to certain diseases like malaria and so on. Maybe I must rethink that because I have my own little mining concession. Maybe I should start looking, and men trouble from malaria quite a lot. So maybe I should begin thinking about infusing more women on the camp, because I deliberately, for example, taking a decision that I will have a male by ear rather than a female by ear, because of the natural temptation for men who are not necessarily spiritually minded out there. It was like when the East Indians came, only a few women came. And so you had a lot of homicide and suicide because the dowry, who could pay the better dowry, had this challenge. But I just wanted to piggyback, for the want of a better word, from your view on the resilience of women against these diseases. And maybe I too must change my view, wanting to avoid any possible conflict that may arise, or in other words, keeping away the temptation.
Well,
That might be rather ticklish or simplistic.
this is very interesting. Let me ask you while we're at this, because we do want to get to, you know, the implications for the church. But before that, last week we indicated that, you know, for example, there are only, I think we counted 5 female prime ministers in Caribbean governments. Do you think Caribbean men I'm asking the question a little differently, but do you think Caribbean men are threatened by women?
I believe in a sense they are, because in some societies, if you do the stats, women are numerically predominant. And if women begin to believe or think that they should assume certain leadership positions, the voting power of women, we now have women suffrage. You had universal adult suffrage. Women now can vote and decide on who should be the leader of their constituency and so forth. I think there is a real threat, because without the support of women, some men cannot make it in politics, because they're more than half of the population, really. And if women push the liberation idea in all spheres, we'll have even challenges in the clergy, which is an area I know we may not have time to look at, but is another serious area where women for years, decades, have been marginalized.
Well, you know, I'm wondering, well, we're going to come back to that, because I believe this is going to consume some time. So let me ask you this question before we go there. Biologically, you know, we started talking about this. Males and females are functionally different in terms of chromosomes. I have a temptation to ask you another question, but I'll resist. So functionally, there's a difference between males and females. One of the main differences has to do with procreation. There are, of course, many other differences. You know, men, for example, tend to have thicker skin, denser and stronger bones, and more muscle. Women, on the other hand, have a better sense of smell and are able to differentiate colors better, etc. And, you know, we could talk about so many other differences. But the question is, do these differences dictate professional behaviors? You know, so that we see that women have had to struggle to get into certain sectors of society. Women have had to struggle to become pilots. There was, for example, a riddle that we used to tell many years ago about a gentleman who was sick, and not a gentleman who was sick. Somebody was sick, and the surgeon, when he went into the operating theater, the surgeon said, "Oh, I can't operate. That's my son." And who's the surgeon? And the riddle was so composed that the surgeon was the mother, but nobody answered correctly because everybody assumed that a surgeon would be a man, which was really demonstrating that there is this concept that certain roles are not for women. So when I ask if the differences of biology, the functionality differences between males and females, do they dictate professional behavior, or should they?
I think they do to a significant degree, depending on the profession, because some women do better. People argue that sometimes, I give an example, the first week when we began the talk, the discussion, that in some quarters, men in the military were saying that you don't give a woman the control if you are to drop a bomb or to carry out some destructive maneuver, because of the emotional makeup of women. They will begin to see how many women, how many children, and so forth would be affected. There are certain professions like nursing, teaching, almost everywhere. The nursing and teaching professions are dominated by women. Service-driven professions are dominated by women because of this caregiving nature of women. Men tend to be more in the hardcore. I'm yet to see the day when the army will be dominated by women, because those were all strong-armed. If you look back even in time, in Carib society, we started out the discussions with the Caribs. In Carib society in the Caribbean, in the early days, as soon as the boy was 4, he was taken away and placed in the car bed to be trained, because they felt if the boy had remained close to the women, they would become weak and emotional wrecks and cannot respond rigorously to war and military strategies and maneuvers. This will need some scientific testing through research to determine the variations and differences. What we are in fact doing here is making some assumption outside of concrete evidence and research to show that in reality, there is a greater suitability for men for certain jobs as against women for certain jobs based on their biological makeup and their dispositions. Because we cannot even go the realm of personality, because the personality traits may cut across boundaries, whether male or female. But it's an interesting thought that needs exploration and serious analysis to show to what extent women are constrained or constricted in certain professions because of the way they are made up. And maybe for good reason, because in some jobs you cannot get that length of time off, maternity leave. Though we had an argument that men should get maternity leave in support.
Some jurisdictions are now given paternity leave, and there is that debate. But here's the other interesting thing. You know, I don't suppose that this directly impacts the church, because philosophically we don't subscribe to neutrality in gender, but that is a big there's a big shift in society today. So, you know, they're now talking about gender neutrality. So even if we look at transgenders, you know, the other day they had the debate in athletics, whether or not transgenders should be given authorization to run in certain races against natural other persons. But the interesting thing in my mind is, when an individual is born male or female and decides to change their gender to become the other, how would that fit in with functionality on the job, and whether or not individuals are suited for certain functions based on the biological makeup? You know, just an interesting thought.
Yeah, I think that they're using hormonal supplements. For example, transgender moving from female to male might take testosterone supplements or injections to develop muscle strength and so forth. But that biology issue is a critical one. Maybe God did not intend, maybe, just maybe, for women to do certain things or to take over certain functions because of their biological makeup. But I know for sure where historically they felt that women did not have the brain power as men, that has been dispelled, and significantly so. But in terms of the physical, and if you look at the shape, men were born with powerful shoulders. Women develop hips because of that they have to, for childbearing purposes and so on. And therefore that in itself, in terms of physical structure, was suggestive. But even if you have transgenders, I think they cannot survive, they cannot get the strength necessary unless you use supplements. So there is a clear distinction biologically that we must give attention to, even if it is superficial.
Well, I don't want to say that this is superficial, because, for example, a man would never, well, you know, these days they say you should never say never, but a man cannot give birth to a child. You know, that's a functional difference, clearly made that way. Women, when you look at the hip structure of women, they are engineered to bear children, and men are not engineered for that. So that clearly is a functional difference. I think, interestingly though, you know, so we could talk about strength and whether functionality, there was intentionality in ascribing or assigning certain roles to males or females. But you said, and I want to quote you now, although I can't do that, I can only paraphrase because I don't remember your exact words. But you indicated that clubs, for example, I think you mentioned the Lions Club, that the clubs where women are involved tend to outdo the clubs where only males are involved, showing that when the woman power gets in, it transforms the way the club functions. Now let's take all of this to the church now, because the church was once, I'm talking about the leadership of the church, was once a male-dominated organization, right? So if we look at women's liberation in the church, there are clearly more women than men in the church today. I mean, I think the Pew Research, Banner and his group there, and that is a outstanding, well-known research group. Over and over, the research do show that even in the Seventh Adventist Church, there are more females than male. The most conservative estimates that I've seen is 53-47. And of course, you know, statistically, but when you look at the congregations, when you go to church on Sabbath morning and you look at the congregations, you are seeing more like 70-30. The men are not present. And that is a troubling reality. But let me continue with my line of argument here. Not only are there more women, but it seems that women tend to be more progressive and hence more informed, more qualified academically, and generally also more caring. So we may want to say more pastoral. Now, I believe the issue is, do we select leaders based on gender or based on spiritual gifts and ability? Is this not the issue with male and female roles in the church? Because, you know, some people believe that women should not serve in leadership position or at least as elders and so on. And in spite of whatever the position of the church may have been, and I'm not talking about pastors now, I'm talking about the local congregation. There are still local congregations where women are not selected as elders because in their minds, that's a male space. I would like to get your input there.
Bill, I've been in the church for quite a while. And so I can connect with the contemporary realities as well as what it was traditionally. I'll say from in the 70s, I came in around 1972, thereabout, 72. And it was taboo for a woman to even go on the rostrum with the older elders of the church. I became first elder at my church at 24, and that was because of the fact that I had to show certain discipline. I had to be with the elder men, and they had to see that you are respectful, you knew the word, you knew the spirit of prophecy, and you can fulfill that role. In that era, women never went on the rostrum, not even to sing as they could today. They had to occupy the lower level. And that is how rigid those guys were with respect to the role and function of the women. And since our church is global, a lot of what we practice in the local church, to my mind, stems from the wider church, from the general conference level. And my take is that at the general conference level, as it relates to women functioning at any strata in the church, you will have serious resistance from the Africans, from Africa, Asia, and those patriarchally driven societies. But don't underrate what happens even in some congregation on to now, because culture and traditions are passed down from one generation to the other. And there are some younger elders who today will still stoutly resist certain things, especially when they themselves are not educationally endowed. And there is this misconception that if you're called to be a leader, God will empower you. Yes, God will empower you, but you have to avail yourself for the empowerment. God is not going to create a miracle every time to make a man good enough to be the leader of the church. If able women are there and have the capacity to lead the local church, and mostly you're dealing with women, so be it. If you have men with the capacity to do so, and the women want step back? Yes. But why will the church not utilize its spiritual gifts for advancement and development because of some gender issue? And this was a question where they went back to ancient times to show that because of the menstrual cycle, women cannot be there for certain services and so forth. Some women pass the age. And what about those who don't want a man anyhow? Or do not wish to get married or start a family? The same issue will definitely not apply. But we have to educate our people and get them to understand that they must take in context even scriptural references that they use, that women's voice must be limited in the congregation. But it's a challenge even now. But in the bigger churches, the more modern churches, people are moving away from that. You have first elders who are now women in churches in Guyana. And that shows that we are respecting talents. And we refer to Ellen White, who was given, and if you go back to the prophecy was then given to the mantle was then given to the weakest of the weak. First, it came to men. And that in itself was suggesting that God probably would have preferred men to carry out the issue. And then I have a big one that time wouldn't permit. Jesus had 12 disciples. And all, despite he tried to empower women, none. But I can understand that.
But can I interrupt you a little bit? But I want to go back to the role of Ellen White, because this is an argument I've heard too. So the first choice was a male in a male-dominated society. I think that's logical. My understanding of scriptures, I look at it, it appears to me as though God tends, in a number of cases, to work through culture, right? So he doesn't just come and turn things upside down like that. So he works with the system and then he moves it from where it is to where he wants it to be. And so I would argue that the first choice was a man because, that was the cultural thing. But notice immediately after, the man did not cooperate what God did, right? And weakest of the weak, the concept there, of course, we know that Ellen White was a sick lady.
Not educated.
She had a particular health condition where doctors said she would die before she reached age 15, etc. So I'm just thinking that it probably is not a wise thing to say that, okay, God chose a man first, so that means that man is always the preference. But I think God works with the system that we have, and then he takes us to where he wants us to be.
I think that's a fundamental point. And I'm glad that you emphasized that point, because I was thinking the same thing, that Jesus respected the cultural nuances of the society in which he came, but he used, I will say, emotional intelligence, for the want of a better word. For me, the best example of emotional intelligence was how Jesus dealt with the men. When the Pharisees, when they brought the woman who was caught in the very act of adultery, we saw the double standards. And Jesus spoke to a woman in public, which was again taboo to the Pharisees. And how did he deal with it? You know the story as a theologian. Neither do I condemn thee when they all left. Go and sin no more. I think that was the biggest expression of support for women liberation. The way Christ dealt with the Pharisees on that particular occasion. But I do embrace the point that where they are able men and they do not support the work, and when there are men who are not able, obviously we go with the woman, but I don't think God was necessarily, did you think he was establishing an order of precedence?
But I don't think so. And that's the point I was making. I believe God works with the system. We say often, he takes us from where he meets us and he leads us to where he wants to carry us. But we must not overestimate what Jesus did with women in the New Testament. And as I mentioned, my master's thesis was on social liberation, particularly female liberation. Women were really in a terrible state in the days of Jesus. You were not supposed to talk to anybody but your husband outside of the home. So your role was to be at home and rear children. But look at what Jesus did. Look at Mary Magdalene. Look at how Jesus had women taking him around, supporting his ministry. And so this was radical. This was huge. I mean, Jesus, and again, I'm showing that Luke was deliberate in showing that this is what Jesus did. And meeting Mary, the first person after the resurrection, and commissioning her to take the message to the disciples. I think that is huge. And sometimes we probably don't give it the emphasis that it deserves. It is the first evangelist who was a female.
Yeah, and and one of the things too that we needed to note, that women were the first to go to the sepulchre the Sunday morning to determine what would have happened. And it could well be that women will first receive the message because they seem to have a natural inclination to worship and to please God. Many successful scholars and men generally give testimonies to the fact that the way they are, or they reach today, the positions they've reached, the direct result of the prayers of their mothers. And in some cases, the father figure was not even present in the lives of some very successful men. And if we look back in the Bible, women were disciples, as you said. Women were models of faith. The woman that pressed forward just, if I could touch the hem of his garment, she had that faith that she would become healed. The woman at the well that gave Jesus the drink. So women played a very important role in supporting the ministry of Christ and promoting evangelism. And even today, I don't see how you're going to succeed in an evangelistic exploit to the fullest if you do not have a good support from women. So the two sexes must complement each other to work out the purposes of God in our congregations and in society generally.
So as we prepare to wrap up, Doc, and my perhaps second to last question, depending on how time plays out here, because our time is almost up. But so let's come back to this issue now in terms of this the liberation movement and the implications for the church. Sometimes as a church, we allow society to lead the way, and then we get on board. Do you think the church should be more involved in sounding the cause of women, or should we just follow the lead of society?
The Bible tells us we should be the head and not the tail. We should be the light of the world, and the church should lead the way because of its connection to the Father. I think for too long, the church has been reactive rather than proactive. And I think sometimes the church becomes a bit fearful of what the perception of society will be of the church if we are to take the lead in certain things. If something is done wrong and it's a national outcry, the church takes a long time. The church is very guarded before the church makes a response. And I think the church should be pace setters, the pace setters. We should set the pace in the church with respect to women empowerment and women liberation, because we need to demonstrate love irrespective of gender, of class, or ethnicity. And that's the bottom line. But is the church prepared to lead? Yeah.
Yeah, I was saying we at the same time, we know that to some extent, the church is a reflection of the society to some extent. If you have people in the church who have their own struggles, a lot of male in the church are males, and they themselves, some of them that is, are insecure. We spoke about the fact that men are seeing the progress women are making, and they're not making that kind of progress. And if they're in positions of making decisions, then it's always going to be a little struggle and a challenge there.
Well, first of all, men must begin to accept equality at the level of the family, husband and wife relationships. Does the man in the church, the elder in the church, does he see his wife as equal? Does he allow her to participate in the decision-making process? Naturally, from biblical times, he's the priest and the person that is in control. But I think the changes will be gradual. Right now, we perpetuate inequality by having women's ministries, in my view, because you're in fact saying that this itself is something separate and apart for women. I hope I'm not jumping out here, as against a strong family life ministries where these are components or subsets. Because if you're saying, oh, women must meet by themselves to strategize and to do this, and men meet by themselves to strategize, we are perpetuating that there is a difference in terms of approach. We want to talk to men, and we don't want the women to hear what we are saying to the men. I think there has to be a deliberate attempt to fuse these groups together for better results. I know this is a contentious issue I'm raising here, but
well, we really don't. I mean, it is an interesting point you're making. We don't have time to go into all of the details. There is also the counter view that says there are some issues that women have that women can best deal with. It's an interesting debate, and maybe one of these days we're going to explore it on Let's Talk here, but our time is almost up, and I wanted to ask you one final question. So let me jump into that. From a sociological perspective, is it a reality that the family, I shouldn't say is it, I should say it is, right? It is a reality that the family is the basic building block of society. I don't think we can get away from that. The strength of the family, the strength of the family unit will, to some extent, determine the strength of society. So with that being the case, what, if any, is the impact of the women liberation movement on the family units, and how does this affect the wider society? I think, there is this argument that some elements of this liberation movement go overboard. We are discussing a balanced approach. I think we agree that, women should take their rightful places, but, and maybe, the feminist perspective. So when it becomes ultra and, we only want women and we don't want to associate with men, and that becomes a little negative. Is the women's liberation movement impacting the family unit in any way?
I would say yes, because while they serve the useful function in positioning women in society, women in the church believe that they now have a right, or they have the right to perform certain actions to determine whether they will keep a pregnancy, whether they must show respect to the husband, whether they must allow their husband to know about their savings and their plans and so forth. When you push the independence of women to the extent that it negates certain traditional values of cooperation and collaboration and cohesion for the betterment of the family, without understanding all the nuances, some women take up a position and say, now gone are the days when I would allow certain things to happen. And once women have taken up that stand, it creates conflict. It exacerbates the already conflictive situation within families. So I'm saying the wise thing to do is for women to accept certain things and look to God's guidance. How would Jesus have done this? Or how would Jesus have done that? And if you're going to have balance and unity in the family, there must be collaboration, must be compromise, there must be consent, there must be sharing of roles, duties, and functions within the family towards a common good. But if the woman in the church takes up a liberated role based on what transpires in the world, it will not work according to what God requires. You must accept that which speaks to good religion, to God-fearing principles and standards, and you accept those that are in keeping with your convictions.
That is precisely why I wanted to ask that question, because I wanted us to clarify those issues. That's an excellent place for us to end. Our time has expired in any case. But I want to say thank you so much, Dr. English, for sharing with us. I believe the last 3 weeks we have covered some very important areas. And of course, our aim here is not to explore every facet of the subject, but to provide a point for a continuing discussion. And I trust that in individual congregations and families that this discussion will continue. I think one of the very important things that families need to do is to consider what is happening to men in society. But again, our time is up. I want to thank you so much for exploring this very important subject with us. It was a delight talking with you, and we trust that all of our viewers, those of you who have expressed your comments, we appreciate it, and we wish you God's blessings. That's all the time we have for today. So until next time, may God's blessings be yours.